The Major League Baseball Hall of Fame. Since 1936, it has become a sacred place, much like the Pantheon, a temple of the gods, where players, managers, umpires, executives, and pioneers of the game hope to be inducted and be immortalized forever. However, over the past couple of decades, the voting process has become hypocritical and frankly feels a bit broken. The current system in place where the Baseball Writers of America control the ballot simply just does not work anymore in the modern era. They have become way pickier, which has caused a concerning backlog of players who are worthy to be Hall of Famers. From a writer who refused to vote for players like Mike Piazza because of suspected steroid use and used Piazza's acne as a reason why, to writers who refused to vote for Tom Glavine and Greg Maddux because they simply won't vote for any player who played during the steroid era. It is about damn time that we reevaluate the Hall of Fame voting process and what the Hall of Fame should be in the future. Before we talk about the future, we first need to dive into how we got here in the first place. The National Baseball Hall of Fame was established in 1936 in Cooperstown, New York by Stephen Carlton Clark. He was one of the heirs to the Singer sewing machine fortune. Sewing machines were a pretty big deal back then, and actually, I guess they still are a pretty big deal. Kudos to sewing. Anyway, Stephen had two goals with the hall. One was to create a place where people from all over would want to visit, since the Great Depression and Prohibition was devastating to local tourism in Cooperstown. And two, he wanted to create a place that celebrated the national pastime. He asked the National League president at the time, Ford Frick, if he would give his blessing on Stephen creating the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. Now, you might be asking, why Cooperstown? To quickly go over this, that's all because of the Doubleday myth. This myth was started by a man named Abner Graves, who was a mining engineer. He said that Civil War Union Army officer Abner Doubleday invented baseball in Cooperstown in 1839. The Spalding Commission, created by the sporting goods company Spalding, was tasked to find the true origin of baseball, and they kinda just took his word for it, and the public was generally favoring this claim. However, today there's criticism from modern-day baseball historians that believe this myth is false, but that's neither here nor there. Okay, now let's get into the voting process. In 1936, the first class of Hall of Fame members were named. This was before their official induction, when the Hall of Fame would open its doors for the first time in 1939, which also marked the believed 100-year anniversary of the invention of baseball. 5 players were elected: Babe Ruth, Ty Cobb, Honus Wagner, Christy Mathewson, and Walter Johnson. So who voted them in? Well, that was the job of the Baseball Writers of America, a group that was founded in 1908 to specifically allow its members to have access to team clubhouses and press boxes for press and media coverage. The reason for allowing the members of the association to be the gatekeepers of the Hall of Fame was pretty straightforward. The Hall of Fame chose the association because they were the only ones covering Major League Baseball the most regularly. So ideally, they would know the most about the game and its history. Back then, in 1936, games weren't televised, and believe it or not, the Yankees, Dodgers, and Giants absolutely refused to allow their games to be broadcast on the radio at the time. On top of that, interleague play didn't exist, so there were teams and players some cities would never see, so the baseball writers were realistically the only third party that were there to witness these players on a regular basis. For this first ever vote, the only criteria the writers had was to make their picks based on players' legacies. How these players ended up on the ballot to begin with was also a voting process where the baseball writers were instructed to pick players from the 20th century. Additionally, there was a special veterans committee that was instructed to choose players from the 19th century, since they were more familiar with players from that time frame. There were no restrictions on who could be selected either. That meant any players who were active, and even those banned from baseball itself, like Shoeless Joe Jackson, were eligible. And of course, the most important part, any player that received 75% of votes would be inducted into the Hall of Fame. Voters were told they could vote for any 10 players that made it onto the ballot. They were also instructed they must vote for 10 players. Now, a few things to note, and some might be obvious. Not a single one of those 5 players were unanimous selections. Ty Cobb had the highest votes of the group with a 98.2%. Additionally, legendary players like Cy Young only received 49.1% of the vote and did not get in on the first ballot. So even in the first ever voting and ballot process, there was a very high level of pickiness. I mean, come on, all these writers couldn't unanimously agree that Babe Ruth belongs in the Hall of Fame? And this was the beginning of mistakes that just refused to be corrected. If you didn't already know, the Writers Association is also responsible for voting on end-of-season awards like MVP, Cy Young, Rookie of the Year, and Manager of the Year. Over the years, the guidelines have evolved on the criteria needed to be Hall of Fame ballot eligible. Now, I have no issue with the names on the ballot and how they get on it to begin with. It's pretty straightforward anyway. As long as a player has played 10 years in MLB and were chosen by the screening committee, they go on the ballot. This is, of course, as long as a player has been retired for at least 5 years. If the player doesn't get voted in on the first ballot, they stay on it for 10 years as long as they receive at least 5% of the vote. And then there's, of course, the ineligible list. These are those who are currently banned by baseball, like Shoeless Joe Jackson and Pete Rose. However, my concern is with how the Baseball Writers of America are considering casting their votes, especially over the past couple of decades. Before we move forward, I'd like to take a moment to try and save you some money. Shout out to SeatGeek for sponsoring. You can use promo code JabroniBaseball to get $20 off your first purchase. SeatGeek is the official ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball. You can use SeatGeek for sports, concerts, music festivals, Broadway shows, comedy shows, and more. Again, my viewers get $20 off their first purchase with code JabroniBaseball. That's one word, all caps. Click the link in the description to download the app. So let's start with the basics. Who are these writers and how do you get into the association in present day? In order to cast a vote, you must be an active or honorary member of the BWAA for at least 10 years and must have been an active working writer within the past 10 years of the ballot you are voting on. The problem with that is, in theory, a BWAA writer may not have done anything with baseball for 10 years but still be eligible to vote on a ballot that includes players that were still playing when that writer stopped working. In fact, that scenario has already happened. According to a Forbes article in 2014, 3 active voters, Bob Sherwin, Jim Street, and Kirby Arnold, weren't even covering baseball anymore and were running a golf website. Yet even still, they were allowed to vote on the ballot. Before we get into the most egregious examples of BWAA writers not taking the Hall of Fame vote seriously and/or voting with their egos, I want to preface this by saying that most of the BWAA voters take their votes and their standing very seriously and have the game's history and future's best interest in mind. Now let's talk about some of the changes that need to be made. First, we'll start with the 75% vote that is needed to get into the Hall. Where did this number come from? Well, as it turns out, it's just a random number. That's all it is, a random number that was decided back in 1936 by NL President Ford Frick and members of the Associated Press. They didn't do any test ballots or do any deep studies on why 75%. It's literally a random number they decided on. It could have easily been 51% majority vote or an even higher 90% or 95% vote. If we're going to keep the 75% vote threshold, then I believe we need to get rid of the 10 vote limit on each ballot. With more talented and qualified players than ever before on each ballot, we need to adjust this, but in a perfect world, I would recommend adjusting the vote in percentage and the 10 vote limit. ESPN's Jason Stark spoke openly about this, saying that a broken system is forcing him to vote the way he has been. He said he didn't want to waste any of his 10 votes and believes players like Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens deserve to get in, but that he had to change his votes to other players because he didn't think the other voters would support Bonds or Clemens. Stark wasn't alone in his frustration with the voting system either. In 2013, 5 voters in protest sent in blank ballots where they said their issue was with the confusion around the standards they were supposed to judge. Another ESPN writer, TJ Quinn, wrote an article on why he gave up voting completely. He cited a few reasons why, but the most 3 concerning examples were that he heard writers saying that they couldn't wait for certain players to make the ballot so they could leave their names unchecked. There is also the problem of the steroid era, and that because the Hall of Fame and MLB won't provide guidelines on PED use, it forced 575 different eligible writers to apply 575 different standards. And he felt that some voters use their votes to punish or reward players. players. He used Albert Bell as an example where he didn't get enough votes on the ballot because of the way he treated reporters during his career. I'll go ahead and link Jason Stark and TJ Quinn's ESPN articles in the description below where they go in depth as to why this system is broken and why TJ Quinn decided to stop voting. They're both very good reads and I highly recommend checking both articles out. Now it gets even weirder. Additionally, in 2014, Deadspin bought a vote from an anonymous BWAA writer and allowed the public to decide on how to vote. Why'd they do this? Well, they did it to specifically mock the voting process publicly. This all happened a decade ago and absolutely nothing has been done to address these issues that not only the public but even BWAA writers themselves are bringing to light. But these problems are nowhere near being new. The forced pickiness of being held to only 10 votes has been an issue for a long time. Writers have left players like Tom Seaver, Nolan Ryan, and even Hank Aaron completely off their ballots. I mean, are you kidding me? Hank Aaron is not a 100% unanimous Hall of Famer, and there's kind of a reason for that. Some of the writers have said that if they know for sure a player will get 75% of the vote, they won't vote for them and instead use their votes on other players they believe may not get enough support on one particular ballot. The logic behind this is that hopefully over the next 10 years, that said player can build a solid enough case where the writers would want to vote them in. Even though the stats won't change and that player's impact to the game won't change, the writers could change their minds on them, which adds to how extremely subjective it's becoming. I said change a lot in like one sentence. But yes, it's more like maybe they'll just feel like a player is a Hall of Famer next year or on their final ballot, and it needs to be more objective based versus how they feel on a certain year when they're voting. Another reason behind players never being unanimously voted in, besides Mariano Rivera finally becoming the first player to do so in 2019, is largely due to writers believing if Babe Ruth didn't get it 100%, then nobody deserves it. To preserve the legacy of their predecessor BWAA writers, some even go as far as not voting for anyone on their first ballot just to make sure the popular picks don't go in unanimously. However, it's widely believed that the reason Mariano made it in unanimously, which he absolutely deserved, was because as of 2018, every Hall of Fame voter's ballot would be made public. So now there was transparency where voters couldn't hide and would have to answer to their reasoning. Ken Griffey Jr., for example, had 3 voters not vote for him. Those writers, as far as any research I've done, have still not come forward to explain why. This new change was obviously not universally loved by all the writers, as a few of them believe now that their votes have become public, writers will give in to public pressure. Next, there's the issue of perceived steroid use, where reported 15 voters did not vote for Greg Maddux, a first ballot Hall of Famer anyway, simply just because he pitched in the steroid era. Think about that for a second. Maddux, one of the greatest pitchers to ever play the game, is not unanimous because some writers believed he may have taken PEDs with zero evidence to support that claim. The system is broken. The statement I made in the beginning of this video, where a writer didn't vote for Mike Piazza because he linked his acne with PED use, was not a joke. Murray Chass, a baseball blogger who wrote for the New York Times and Associated Press, a man who received the J.G. Taylor Spink Award, which is also the highest possible award given by the Baseball Writers Association, said this. He also said he didn't vote for Craig Biggio because he suspected PED use. None of this has ever been confirmed, nor has he ever failed a drug test. He even admitted that he consciously limits his votes even when there are more qualified candidates. Then he went as far as to say that he would give up his vote but then kept it just to annoy his critics. And the stories get worse. MLB.com's Ken Gurnick only voted for one player in 2014. That player, Jack Morris. When he was asked why he didn't vote for Glavine or Maddux, he said, "As for those who played during the period of PED use, I won't vote for any of them." Bob Brookover, another BWAA writer, said he didn't vote for Curt Schilling because he lied once about chewing tobacco, therefore he had questionable integrity and could have lied about PED use. He also didn't vote for Jeff Bagwell because it's possible he lied about taking steroids as well. This has gotten to the point of insanity where players who never failed a single drug test and put up first ballot Hall of Fame numbers are being left out because some writers need to make a statement. What I can only describe as ego has left some of the game's greatest players out of the Hall of Fame. At least Glavine, Maddux, Bagwell, and Piazza would make it into the Hall of Fame, and the overall majority of writers do not feel the same way as the examples I just provided. This begs the question, what is the Hall of Fame? Is it an objective place where we can see the game's greatest to ever do it, or is it a place where its history is told by how the baseball writers want us to see it? In my opinion, the writers are getting too wrapped up in comparing modern-day players to legends of the past. Instead, they really should be compared to the level of competition they played against. For example, the way the game is played today is far different than it ever has been. We very well may never see another pitcher reach 300 wins or a hitter hit 3,000 hits, and not because of lack of talent. Pitchers and hitters are better and more talented than they've ever been before, but they'll never reach these milestones because of how baseball has evolved. The way I see it, if a player dominated during his time and is essential in telling the story of baseball, he should get in. We should not be overthinking this. Now, yes, I understand that's what the museum portion of the Hall of Fame is for, to preserve and tell the story of baseball, but these players should be rewarded with baseball immortality. As of 2024, the main instruction the Hall gives to voters on how to vote is simple. Voting shall be based upon the player's record, playing ability, integrity, sportsmanship, character, and contributions to the teams on which the player played. I mean, that's basically been the criteria since the beginning. MLB and the Hall of Fame makes no mention about what to do with players who have or have not tested positive for steroids. They end up on the ballot just like every other eligible player that hasn't been banned by baseball and passes the initial committee vote to get on the ballot in the first place. The hypocrisy of the situation is baffling, and ultimately it's the players and the fans who suffer the most from this. Not to focus on the steroid era for too long, but I do believe this needs to be addressed. MLB has not banned players like Barry Bonds or Roger Clemens, who are arguably, as far as statistics are concerned, the greatest hitter and pitcher we've seen in the past 30 years, if not ever. The Hall of Fame Museum itself has plenty of exhibits and artifacts that showcase these two as well. So if MLB has no problem with it, and the Hall of Fame itself has no problem with telling their story, then why are the baseball writers the arbiters of what's right and wrong when it took them 80 years to pick the first unanimous player? It's clear that they get things wrong, yet nobody steps in. Additionally, yes, these are the same voters who voted for them on their endless list of awards like their MVPs and Cy Youngs that now refuse to vote for them to put them in the Hall of Fame. It doesn't seem fair when Bud Selig, who oversaw the entire steroid era, profited off of it, and essentially let it happen, was voted in the Hall of Fame in 2017 with a 93.8% vote. If the steroid era players are vilified so much, then it makes no sense that Selig was voted in at all, much less at essentially a 94% clip. When the Astros cheating scandal came out, the people at the top of the Astros organization were punished, and I think this should have been no different with Selig being at the top. Moving away from the steroid era, of which I'll be talking more about in a separate video, as I believe this deserves its own longer conversation on why it's time to start voting for players like Bonds, Clemens, McGuire, Sosa, and A-Rod, and more into Cooperstown. Now, I'd like to go over my top 4 players that should absolutely be in the Hall of Fame that the writers have completely botched voting in. The first is Keith Hernandez. It is a crime that he isn't in the Hall of Fame, and an even bigger crime that he has never received over 11% of the vote as his highest percentage, which feels personal. In an era where we're obsessed with stats and metrics, he really ticks a lot of boxes off. He ended his 17-year career with a WAR of 60.3, which is higher than quite a few in the Hall already, and ranks 123rd among position players all time. He was an MVP and finished in the top 21 of MVP votes in 9 straight seasons. Won a batting title, a 2-time World Series champion, 5-time All-Star, 2-time Silver Slugger, and won 11, count 'em, 11 Gold Gloves at first base. He's widely regarded as the greatest defensive first baseman in baseball history. He's had his number retired by the Mets, and he's in both the Mets and Cardinals Hall of Fame. If you really want to add more to his resume, he's a part of of an award-winning broadcast group with the Mets and SNY, where they are regularly called the best booth in baseball. His impact on and off the field is absolutely Hall of Fame worthy. The teams he's played on have recognized it, the fans have recognized it, and it's time for the BWAA writers to recognize it too. The second player is Don Mattingly. His highest vote percentage has been 28.2%. He had an excellent 14-year career with the Yankees that was cut short due to back issues. Even still, retiring at only 34 years old, he won the AL MVP, a batting title, was a 3-time Silver Slugger, a 6-time All-Star, and won 9 Gold Gloves. He was regarded as one of the best players in baseball for his time. He amassed a 42.4 WAR and a 127 OPS+. He was also pretty much the only reason to tune in and watch the Yankees during objectively one of their most brutal stretches of losing baseball from the early 80s till about 1993. And he was named captain in the most storied franchise in sports. In his post-playing career, he managed both the Dodgers and the Marlins for 12 years, where he won Manager of the Year with the Marlins. His career numbers are near identical to Hall of Famer Kirby Puckett. You just can't tell the story of baseball without mentioning Donnie Baseball, and to me, that's worthy of baseball immortality in the Hall of Fame. My third player is Lou Whitaker, which I think is a pretty popular opinion on being a Hall of Fame snub. He played for 19 years, all with the Tigers, won Rookie of the Year, was a World Series champion, a 4-time Silver Slugger, 5-time All-Star, and won 3 Gold Gloves. With an insane 75.1 career WAR, which, mind you, ranks 51st all-time for position players and has an OPS plus of 117. This is an absolute no-brainer, but he received a 2.9% vote in 2001, and later from a special committee received only 37.5% of the vote. My fourth player is Tim Lincecum, big-time Timmy Jim, the freak. Just breaking the 10-year service mark to be eligible, Lincecum's peak was something that can only be described as you just had to be there. He started an All-Star game, he threw 2 no-hitters, was a 4-time All-Star, a 3-time World Series champion, and won 2 Cy Youngs in a row while garnering MVP votes in the process. And he came up in the top 10 of Cy Young voting the next 2 years as well. He accomplished so much in an incredibly short amount of time. He was absolutely must-see TV when he was pitching and unbeatable when his stuff was on. During his 3 World Series championship runs with the Giants, he pitched in 13 games, starting 6 of them. In total, he pitched 56.1 innings with a win percentage of .714, all while striking out 65 batters to the tune of a 2.40 ERA. That is absolutely elite coming in the postseason. His career was cut short due to injury, but there was nothing like peak Lincecum. With the current voting process, I'm not saying that he should be a first ballot Hall of Famer, but if I'm to stick with my value judgment of what he brought to the game, he was one of the best ever to do it, and how exciting he made baseball in the late 2000s and early 2010s to watch is worth it in my book. Some honorable mentions include Kenny Lofton, who was a beast for 17 years with a 68.4 WAR, who won several Gold Gloves playing center field and 622 stolen bases. Bernie Williams, who was instrumental on those Yankee championship runs, played 16 years with a 49.6 WAR and an OPS plus of 125. Doing all of this while playing Gold Glove defense at a premium position like center field. That is not easy to do. And last, Billy Wagner, who had a 2.31 ERA over the course of a 16-year career with 422 saves. Besides one season, he was as reliable as a reliever could be and one of the best in the business. But at least it looks like he's going to be voted in soon, as most recently he just fell 5 votes shy at 73.8%. Okay, I lied. There's one more. Joey Votto needs to get in. Dude played at an elite level for 17 years, was an MVP, and basically always in the NL MVP conversation. A 6-time All-Star, Gold Glover with a 64.5 WAR and an OPS plus of 166. That's Hall of Fame stuff. I know he just retired, but I'm already reading that he's borderline, and honestly, I don't want to hear it. He needs to get in. So how do we fix all this? If we're going to keep the 10-vote maximum and the 75% entrance window, we need to make sure all 10 votes are being used. If they aren't, you lose your ability to vote. None of this empty ballot sending nonsense either that doesn't help anybody, or just voting for 6 players when you could have voted for 10 just because, again, you were trying to send a message. The reason why the Baseball Writers of America were necessary to vote in 1936 does not fly anymore. Again, they had to do it back then because nobody else covered baseball on a regular basis. It was an exclusive club the baseball writers created to guarantee they had access to all games, which de facto made them the most qualified to do it. Today, we have analysts, media personnel, reporters, radio broadcasters, TV broadcasters, writers, and even you and me that watch the game regularly. What am I getting at here? More voters, more voices in the conversation, have active players vote, have living Hall of Famers vote, have fans vote. We need to diversify it as much as possible to limit any ego or special interest one group may have. The weight of each vote would obviously vary, but that's something that can be fine-tuned and observed over time. And lastly, we also need to have a clearer standard as to who gets in. Someone who gets in on their 8th ballot, for example, should have gotten in on any of the earlier ballots. Their career numbers haven't changed, but the subjective opinions on those numbers obviously did. If there's a clear threshold standard that everyone can agree on, this would make that part easier. We should also make the Hall of Fame a place where people want to visit to see the plaques of their favorite players. Keeping players out of the Hall of Fame by being too picky does not help this cause. I'm not saying basically leave the doors open for any player to get in, but surely it wouldn't hurt to let more regularly in than we have been. It's good for players, it's good for the fans, and it's good for baseball. We want to see more greatness in the Hall of Fame, not less. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like and subscribe. It really helps me and the channel out a lot, and I surely do appreciate that. What do you think of the current Hall of Fame voting? What would you want differently? Do you agree or disagree with any of my takes? Sound off in the comments below, and I'll catch you in the next video. Later.